The sea runs grey and hostile, heaving in long, cold swells beneath a sky the colour of old pewter. Aboard the British merchant vessel Empire Heritage, the crew have grown accustomed to the particular tension of sailing in wartime waters. They scan the horizon. They check the instruments. They try not to think too hard about what lies beneath. And then the torpedo hits. The explosion tears through the hull with a sound that men who survive it will struggle to describe. Not quite a bang, more like the world itself cracking open. Water floods in. The ship lists. The order comes to abandon her. The Empire Heritage goes down. But here is where this story departs from every ordinary tale of wartime tragedy, because she is not gone for good. Not remotely. The vessel that would become one of the most remarkable stories in British naval history was not built to be indestructible. She was not coated in some revolutionary armor, not designed with any particular genius for survival. What made her legendary was something stranger, something almost inexplicable. She was raised, repaired, recommissioned, torpedoed again, salvaged again, and sent back into the fight with a stubbornness that bordered on the supernatural. Over the course of the Second World War, this single vessel was sunk or rendered combat ineffective, no fewer than 7 times, and each time Britain refused to let her stay down. The question worth asking is not how a ship survives being sunk 7 times. The question is why anyone kept bothering to bring her back. And the answer to that question says everything about how Britain fought the Second World War. To understand why a ship like this mattered so much that the Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine would spend extraordinary resources salvaging and refitting her again and again, you have to understand the situation Britain found herself in during the early years of the conflict. By 1940, the United Kingdom was in a position of almost suicidal vulnerability. An island nation dependent on imported food, fuel, and raw materials. Britain required something in the region of 1 million tons of supplies every single week simply to keep fighting. The Royal Navy, for all its prestige and tradition, was stretched impossibly thin across multiple theatres. The U-boat menace was not merely a military problem. It was an existential one. Winston Churchill would later admit that the only thing that truly frightened him during the war was the Battle of the Atlantic. In the first 2 years of the war, the Germans sank merchant vessels faster than Britain, and her allies could replace them. The tonnage losses were staggering. Between June 1940 and the end of 1941, the Allies lost over 8 million tons of shipping. 8 million. To put that in some context, each merchant vessel of moderate size represented months of construction, thousands of man-hours, and irreplaceable strategic capacity. Losing one was a blow. Losing hundreds was slow strangulation. In this environment, every vessel that could be salvaged, repaired, and returned to service represented not just economic value, but genuine strategic weight. A ship raised from the harbour floor and sent back out with her holds full of grain or aviation fuel or ammunition was a ship the enemy had failed to remove from the equation. Salvage operations became, in a very real sense, acts of resistance. The vessel at the centre of our story, known variously under different names across her numerous reincarnations, for she was renamed more than once as she passed between different owners and operators, entered service before the war broke out, a sturdy, unremarkable cargo ship of the type that formed the unglamorous backbone of British maritime trade. She was not fast. She was not elegant. She displaced several thousand tons and made perhaps 12 knots in favourable conditions, which is to say she was broadly typical of the vessels keeping the nation alive. What made her extraordinary was not what she was built to do, it was what she refused to stop doing. The mechanics of raising a sunken ship in wartime conditions represent one of the less celebrated engineering feats of the Second World War, and they are worth understanding in some detail. Because without grasping what it actually took to bring a vessel back from the dead, the story of our ship loses half its power. The primary salvage organization responsible for raising British vessels during the war was operated under the auspices of the Ministry of War Transport, coordinating teams of specialist divers, naval architects, and salvage engineers whose work was rarely publicized and almost never glamorized. These men, and they were, by the standards of the era, almost exclusively men, worked in conditions of genuine danger, with equipment that today's offshore engineers would consider laughably primitive. The basic principle of ship salvage relies on buoyancy, which sounds obvious until you consider the practical challenges involved. A vessel resting on the seabed has typically suffered structural damage, flooding throughout multiple compartments, and in many cases fire or explosion damage that has warped her frames and compromised her integrity. To raise her, the salvors must first assess whether raising her is even possible. A calculation involving the depth of water, the degree of damage, the nature of the seabed, and the available equipment. If raising is feasible, the process typically begins with patching. Divers descend, in the case of shallow harbor sinkings in 10 to 20 meters of water. This is grueling but survivable work. In deeper water, it becomes genuinely life-threatening. And seal the major openings with timber, canvas, and cement boxes. These are not elegant repairs. They are, in essence, enormous plasters applied to a catastrophically wounded patient. Once the major ingresses are sealed, compressed air is pumped into the hull, gradually displacing water from the sealed compartments. If the patches hold, and if the structural integrity of the hull is sufficient, the vessel slowly, reluctantly begins to rise. For a vessel of several thousand tons, the lifting force required is enormous. Salvage vessels equipped with heavy lifting gear would be positioned on either side, connected by chains passed beneath the hull during the most hazardous phase of the operation. The combined upward pull of buoyancy and mechanical lifting could, in favorable conditions, bring a moderate-sized vessel to the surface within days. In less favorable conditions, poor visibility, adverse tides, damaged hull, hostile weather, the process could take weeks. Our particular ship endured this process multiple times. Each time she went down, teams were assembled, resources committed, and the slow, difficult work of resurrection begun. The first sinking early in the war was accomplished by aerial bombing in a harbor setting. Shallower water, relatively accessible. The patches applied within days, and the vessel pumped out within a fortnight. The second came at sea, a torpedo strike that left her badly holed, but still floating long enough to be beached on a convenient sandbar, which saved her from the deeper water that would have made recovery far more difficult. The third, well, by the third sinking, the salvors knew her well enough that they had developed something resembling affection for the obstinate old vessel. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. There are accounts. And here we must be honest that some of these exist only in the informal records kept by salvage crews rather than in official documentation, of the men who worked on her coming to regard the ship with a kind of superstitious respect. Salvage work in wartime was not a profession that attracted sentimentality. These were practical engineers dealing with practical problems under pressure of time and enemy action. But there is something in the human character that responds to persistence, even in an inanimate object, and a ship that has been sunk 3, 4, 5 times and keeps coming back, begins to feel less like a machine and more like a statement. One salvage officer whose recollections appear in a privately printed memoir from the 1960s described the fourth raising with a dry humor characteristic of the era. We knew her so well by then that the preliminary survey felt rather like visiting an old patient. Same weaknesses in the port bow framing, same tendency to take water through the starboard aft cable locker. One of my divers said she seemed to be waiting for us. The psychological dimension of her story was not lost on those who knew it. In a war defined by grinding attrition, by the steady accumulation of loss and exhaustion, a ship that simply would not stay sunk carried a meaning beyond her cargo capacity. She became, among those who knew her, a kind of mascot, proof that even the worst the enemy could do was not necessarily permanent. Her crews changed with each recommissioning naturally. Merchant seamen did not, as a general rule, return to a vessel that had been sunk from under them. The trauma of torpedo attack, the explosion, the flooding, the desperate scramble to the boats in often freezing water was not something most men were anxious to repeat on the same hull. But the ships that replaced them accepted their postings with the knowledge that they were sailing aboard something unusual. To place this vessel in proper context, it is worth considering what the Germans and Americans were doing with their own salvage operations during the same period. The Kriegsmarine operated salvage services of considerable competence, particularly in the Baltic and along the Norwegian coast, where the confined waters and relatively shallow depths made recovery operations more straightforward than in the open Atlantic. German naval salvage, however, was predominantly focused on their own surface fleet, the raising of damaged destroyers and cruisers that could be repaired and returned to operational service. The merchant salvage capacity of Germany was limited by the simple fact that Germany was not, by the nature of her strategic position, a nation dependent on maritime supply lines in the way Britain was. The Americans, entering the war after December 1941, brought to salvage operations the characteristic virtues and vices of American industrial thinking: enormous resources, efficient organization, and a tendency to build new rather than repair old. The United States Salvage Service performed extraordinary work at Pearl Harbor, raising and eventually returning to service several of the battleships sunk in the Japanese attack of December 7, 1941. The USS Nevada, the USS California, the USS West Virginia, all raised, all repaired, all returned to action. In this, there is a family resemblance to our British ship story, a shared belief that a vessel raised is a victory denied. But the American approach was, of necessity, focused on capital ships, the great battleships and carriers whose strategic value justified the enormous expense of their recovery. Britain's achievement was different in character. It was the persistence applied not to a battleship but to an ordinary working cargo vessel, the kind of ship that kept the nation eating and fighting, whose value was measured not in gun calibers, but in holds full of tinned beef and aviation spirit and machine tools. The Germans never quite understood this. Their submarine captains reported their kills with justifiable pride, tallying the tonnage sent to the bottom with a grim accountant's satisfaction. What they could not see, what no single U-boat crew could see, was the salvage vessel moving into position a week later, the divers going down, the patches going on, the stubborn refusal to accept the arithmetic of destruction. The legacy of vessels like ours extends well beyond the raw numbers of the Battle of the Atlantic. Significant as those numbers are, the practical lessons learned from wartime salvage operations fed directly into the development of post-war offshore salvage techniques. The Ministry of War Transport's accumulated expertise, The improved diving equipment, the better understanding of structural integrity assessment, the refined methods of controlled flooding and buoyancy management became the foundation on which commercial salvage companies built their post-war operations. The men who learned their trade-raising torpedoed merchantmen in the Clyde or the Mersey went on to raise oil tankers and container ships in the following decades. More broadly, the story of vessels that were sunk and sunk and raised again challenged the prevailing assumptions about the economics of destruction. It is a persistent military fallacy to assume that destroying something once is sufficient, that a weapon fired, a bomb dropped, a torpedo running true, represents a permanent subtraction from the enemy's capacity. Our ship's story, repeated in less dramatic form by dozens of other vessels across the wartime period, demonstrated the flaw in this reasoning. Destruction is not necessarily permanent. Resolution, resources, and engineering skill can undo what violence has done. Exact records of her final fate remain, frustratingly, incomplete. The wartime merchant marine documentation, never as systematic as naval records, was further disrupted by the chaos of the conflict itself. What can be confirmed is that she survived the war, that she was eventually sold for breaking in the late 1940s after suffering the indignity that so many veteran ships suffer. The discovery that the cost of maintaining her to post-war commercial standards exceeded her remaining economic value. She ended not in a dramatic final sinking, but in the methodical dismantling of a breaker's yard, her steel recycled into the rebuilding of a battered continent. There is no museum exhibit dedicated to her, no monument. The maritime museums of Britain hold records of far more glamorous vessels. The great warships, the record-breaking ocean liners, the famous convoys. A cargo ship, however remarkable her history, does not naturally attract the commemorative instinct, but she deserves to be remembered. Return, for a moment, to that grey South Atlantic morning, the torpedo striking, the water rushing in, the crew taking to the boats. Every one of those moments, and there were 7 of them, 7 distinct occasions when everything pointed toward a permanent end, was followed by something that the enemy had not planned for, had not budgeted for, had perhaps not even considered possible. It was followed by someone deciding that this was not, in fact, over. That decision was made by salvage officers filling in requisition forms in cold offices. It was made by divers pulling on their suits in the pre-dawn dark. It was made by engineers staring at damage assessments and concluding that yes, it was possible, yes, it was worth it, yes, she could sail again. It was made, in the larger sense, by a nation that had decided it would not be beaten by the arithmetic of destruction. 7 times an enemy weapon declared her finished. 7 times British hands and British stubbornness declared otherwise. In the final accounting of the war, she carried more cargo, survived more attacks, and outlasted more U-boats than anyone involved in her first sinking could possibly have imagined. She was not the fastest ship in the merchant marine. She was not the largest or the most heavily armed or the most technically sophisticated. She was, in the end, simply the most difficult to kill. And in a war that came down, at its most fundamental level, to the question of who could endure the most and still keep moving, that quality was worth more than any armament. 7 times sunk, 7 times raised, still fighting. Some things, it turns out, simply refuse to stay down.